because we have different language floors or different interpreters who are translating to French and Portuguese. And it is really important that they also hear the sound very clearly so that they can translate to the colleagues who are listening in other languages. The third housekeeping rule is more an invitation. We will have, as you will see in a couple of seconds, a Q&A session, and we would really invite you to invite you to put your questions in the chat. The chat is in the upper right corner of your screen. You have like a blue icon, so to say, and you can click there and you can post your questions there. Also, you can note that if you see questions that are from other language channels, you can go over the comment and then you will have something like that says translate comment. That way you can also engage with other participants who are not speaking in your language, so that you can also see the comments and their annotations, so to say. My colleagues Letty and Dorothy will also be posting very important information, so make sure that you also give it a look at the chat. And the last housekeeping rule is as more like an invitation. We are going to have a survey at the end, and especially if you're a city representative, we kindly ask you to fill out the survey. It's not going to take you longer than 5 minutes, and this is very important for us, as you may have seen in the concept notes and in the invitations. If you're a city and attend to the two webinars, you are eligible to get a chance to win a one-on-one session with our experts from today. And this is the way that we have of also tracking the participation of the cities and also of sharing you the materials and the information that we're going to speak about today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the speakers of today. As I already introduced myself, I'm Adriana Salazar. I'm an advisor of the organizing project CitiesAdapt. And we have also the pleasure of having Jeremy Gorelik, who is a climate finance lead and also the president of Mineral Springs, which is a consultancy that is supporting us with us. And they're like the brains behind every content that you will see today. And also we have my colleague Neil Wormsley, who is a climate adaptation finance specialist and is also working together with Jeremy. And I feel very privileged to have them both here, who are very expert and who have supported so many cities in furthering their climate adaptation projects. Also in the background, not as the speakers, as I said, we have our colleagues Leticia, who is from the GIZ team working with me together. That's Letty, and also Dorothy, who is working also at Mineral Springs today. I don't know, Dorothy, if you can say hi just so that people know who you are. That's Dorothy. Great. And without further ado, I will introduce you to the agenda of today. I'm doing the welcoming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about CitiesAdapt, just to do a little bit of scene setting and so that you get background information as to why we decided to create these sessions. After that, Neil is going to give an overview of adaptation projects in cities, followed by Jeremy, who is going to be presenting how you can fund these projects, these modalities for funding adaptation projects. After that, we're going to have around 20 minutes of a Q&A session. As I said, please don't forget to post your questions in the chat. And after that, we're going to go to the survey, and also I'm going to tell you a little bit about next steps. And now I would like to start with the introduction to CitiesAdapt. As I said, we are the project who is organizing together with Mineral Springs these sessions. We are a GIZ project, which is the organization for the German Development Cooperation. We are a project, an IKI project, that is from the International Climate Initiative, and we're funded by the federal German government. The main objective of CitiesAdapt is to improve the resilience to climate change in cities. And we work specifically with two partner cities. The first of them is the city of Merida in Mexico, and the second one is the city of Umlatuze in South Africa. And how we do this, I want to show you in the next slide because I think it's more illustrative and prettier. But we do this mainly through two ways. The first one is that we try to mainstream climate change adaptation into urban development instruments and policies, and we do that through capacity building and policy advice to our partner cities, Merida and the city of Umlatuze. And the second one is that we support the implementation and the planning of demonstration projects in those two cities. These projects are at the neighborhood level. You will hear more about that when Neil is going over through his presentation. But the characteristics of these projects is that they are nature-based solutions, based on nature-based solutions, so to say, and that they're very participatory in the manner. We'll tell you a little bit about that later on. And CitiesAdapt is also as I said, we work with these two cities, but we're obviously interested in many more cities, and we have had many exchanges with different cities. And as part of our scaling up strategy, we noticed that one of the key issues that cities have is that they do not know how to finance these climate adaptation projects. And seeing that that was one of the biggest challenges, we decided to, as I said, to use the expertise of Jeremy and Neil to make this webinar series. We have been working with them. They have supported us immensely and developing methodologies to implement our demonstration projects. And we thought if we have their expertise, we can also share this with other cities who are kind of like going through the same experiences that our partner cities are going. And that's kind of like the reasoning why we decided to do these sessions today and next week. And just a small commercial, if you're interested in knowing more about our expertise or the areas that we have been working on, just contact us. You're going to see our contact details at the very end. But without further ado, I would then hand over to my colleague Neil, who's going to talk to you about the typologies of adaptation projects relevant for secondary cities. And Neil, I'm going to make you the main presenter so that you can um, move the slides yourself. You should be able to do it now.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you all. So when we are talking about adaptation and resilience in cities, we can potentially be talking about quite a lot of different things in practice. I think, first of all, it's probably helpful to define what we mean by the two terms, because whilst there is a strong overlap and they're often used interchangeably, adaptation and resilience are actually slightly different things. And so I'll just quickly explain what that means. When we talk about adaptation, what we mean is that we're looking at how we adapt at a city level or at other levels to a gradually changing climate. And so, what that might mean in practice is a city may be facing increasing temperatures over time, and so an adaptation measure might be to invest in more urban greening, such as planting trees, green rooftops and walls, and so forth, which help to reduce the ambient temperatures in towns and cities and make them more comfortable to live in. Resilience is along similar lines, but it's actually focusing a little bit more on how to cope with and respond to severe shocks. So, a difference would be, say, a flooding event, which may be expected or unexpected, but has a immediate and strong impact. And so, a resilience building measure. Aside from flood defences and things to reduce the risk of it happening, may also mean having plans and systems in place that allow communities to very quickly recover from the flooding event in case it does happen. So the two overlap, but they are slightly different. And I just wanted to mention that because it is a question that is often asked when talking about this topic. In practice, adaptation resilience measures can take very different forms depending upon the climate impacts being faced, how they're affecting different communities, different areas of a town and city, sectors of the economy, and so forth. And sometimes it can be very direct impacts that we're trying to adapt to, such as heat waves and so forth, and the effects upon the local population. It can sometimes be indirect. So, for example, water shortages in nearby might cause power stations to shut down because they're not getting access to water for their cooling systems, and then you have power cuts, which is sometimes a bit of an unexpected effect, but often happens, and that can often exacerbate other problems. So without power, you can't run air conditioning, and then you have heat problems in towns and cities as well, and other things like that. So as you can imagine, this is a very complex area, and the interventions can be quite wide ranging. And I think it's important to consider this when looking at developing adaptation resilience plans. And it also emphasizes the need to engage with communities to better understand how people are being affected in different places, different locations, because it can be, you could be in one part of a town and be affected by an impact in one particular way. In another, you could be affected very differently. So community engagement is critical to this. as you can see, as I was mentioning, there's quite a lot of different ways that cities and towns can respond. And here are just a few examples from African cities. So if we look at flooding as a major risk in cities like Dakar in Senegal and Cocody in Cote d'Ivoire, they're both badly affected by the risk of coastal flooding, but their approaches have been quite different. In Dakar, and this is partly because they're on the seafront directly. There's been a major investment in physical flood defences in terms of concrete and stone structures to reduce flood risk from storm surges hitting the coast and a rising sea level. In Cocody, they have similar challenges, but because of the local environments, they're able to actually introduce more nature-based solutions. And in this particular case, it's planting mangroves, which actually have a very similar effect to more substantial concrete flood defences as well. In places like Lusaka, the need to build resilience has meant that they have a desire to better understand what these climate risks are in different places. And so they've invested in setting up Earth observation and geospatial data systems to better map these risks and so they can plan accordingly. And in places like Kigali, as I mentioned before, energy security is actually the biggest risk from climate impacts. And so they focus quite heavily on introducing renewable energy across the city and investing in battery storage so that when the impacts are felt by extreme weather events, energy supplies won't be disrupted and the city can continue to operate regardless. The typologies that have been developed to help understand and plan for adaptation resilience building are quite wide ranging. There are a number that have been developed by different organizations, and in many respects, they are all correct, but they are all different depending upon the approach that is most suitable for the town and city. So one set of typologies, which is illustrated here, is are quite suitable when you're focusing on direct threats that you're trying to respond to. And so in this typology, there are a number of different ways that adaptation projects can be identified and planned. First of all, you could have a sector-based approach, which is where you're looking at different sectors that are being affected, which could be the agricultural sector near a town, it could be water infrastructure, so on and so forth. But there is a very clear threat to a particular sector, which needs a sectoral approach to managing. The risk-based approach, as the name implies, is actually looking at what that particular risk is, which could be, say, wildfires that are threatening a town or a city or its wider system, and therefore a response needs to be directed towards that. Similarly, an approach-based is looking at from the other side of the spectrum, where the focus might be on, say, nature-based solutions to help reduce a range of climate risks. So, tree planting and water management in an area might help address multiple threats being faced. And then the other one I really want to kind of highlight here is the difference between incremental and transformational adaptation resilience projects. Now, incremental, as the name suggests, is an approach where you might invest in an adaptation project, but the creation of that project is phased over time and can be scaled up as the potential threat increases. What that might look like could be, say, investing in flood defenses, which can be built upon over time to respond to rising flood risks or sea levels. But through an incremental approach, you don't necessarily have to invest in the full system in one go. The costs can therefore be spread out of time. You just steadily increase it, which can be more effective for longer term threats. Where it's transformational, that might be slightly different. That might be where the threats are so significant and extreme that a larger investment is required, and a full set of flood defences might need to be installed right from the start. And so that would be a very different kind of approach. And then rationale, well, I'll skip over that because we're getting into too much detail there, but I think you have a bit of a sense of this. A different way that this could also be looked at is through a more systemic lens. And whilst this does cut across the other typology, the approach here is when you're thinking about adaptation and resilience from how it affects systems or interventions that might have a systemic effect as a result of it. So, for example, you might want to look at a neighborhood level and look at all the different climate risks and threats in that neighborhood, which could be heat waves, it could be water shortages, so on and so forth. And then you work with those communities to develop a set of projects and actions that might help address those in different ways. As I mentioned before, nature-based systems is another approach which is very popular because of its the wide range of co-benefits that you tend to get from investing in natural solutions, and often they are a lower cost than more expensive concrete solutions to different risks. Then you have other systems such as focusing on governance frameworks, which will help a town or a city to better plan and adapt to changes over time. Look at the broader infrastructure systems and how they can be upgraded to adjust to the changing environment. And then economic and social adaptation is important because one of the key things here is that the most vulnerable groups tend to be those with the least opportunities, the least economic opportunities, and often the poorest in society. Whenever these impacts are felt, they tend to suffer the most because they have the least ability to adapt to them. So, looking at how economic systems can be directed along this, to drive resilience can have a big impact in that respect. Now, finally, I think one thing that is important to note is that financing adaptation can be very, very challenging because many of the projects and systems are both expensive, but they are also not necessarily revenue generating. As they're not revenue generating, it can be quite difficult to set up effective financing approaches for them. And so, what we would always recommend is to think of a hierarchy of interventions for planning the financing. At the top level, it's looking at where adaptation resilience can be integrated into broader investment plans, broader infrastructure planning processes, and so forth, so that the cost of those adaptation resilience measures is a minor incremental cost on top of bigger investments and therefore can be absorbed more easily by project developers and so forth. And this can be done by developing climate smart city master plans, working with developers and requiring them to introduce these measures as part of their project designs. By doing that, it can also help avoid the need to go back and retrofit adaptation resilience into the designs of these projects, so which is obviously a far more expensive way of doing it. The next level down would be to develop investment plans for adaptation projects focusing on particular sectors or areas of a town, and that might incorporate a range of different financing approaches to make it happen. It could include setting up, say, green bonds, if that is something that the town or city is able to do to finance a package of interventions over an area. And then finally, it's looking at the financing for specific projects. And that's something that we'll obviously go into in more detail in this presentation. What you can see, though, is that depending upon the approach taken, there is potentially a wide range of financing mechanisms and instruments that can be used depending upon what you're trying to achieve. And I think at this point, I'm going to hand back to Adriana and the team to talk about how this looks like in practice. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Neil. I took over already the over the presentation rights again, so I can thank you. So as Neil was presenting the typologies of the climate adaptation projects, you probably remember because it was a couple of slides ago that he said that there's exist also these neighborhood level adaptation projects and also there are nature-based solutions. And going back to my introduction of Cities Adapt, that is exactly what we did in the city of Merida. We're still in the implementation process in the city of Umlatuze in South Africa, but in the city of Merida, we already have a demonstration project, and that is what I wanted to show to you. But before I jump into the steps and the things that we did, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of the city because I think this is very important. If you've ever been to Mexico, you know that Merida is in the peninsula of Yucatan, in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's an area that is relatively close to the coast, and every time that there is a hurricane or like big storms, that's the area that gets particularly affected by them. Also, Merida is a city that is extremely hot. In the best months, you can have like 45 degrees, and that's just like not even like in the summer period, but just to give you a little bit of background. So when we decided to work with the city of Merida to develop this implementation project, what we did is that, as I said, with the help from Jeremy and his team, we created a methodology on how we wanted to structure this demonstration project, and that's what we called the model approach. I'm not going to go into detail about this because Jeremy is going to cover the project development cycle in the next session, but just so you know, in case you're also in the process of implementing demonstration projects in your cities, this might be something that might be interesting to you. And this model approach went through the whole process of preparing this demonstration project, obviously in a very participatory manner, together with the community in this co-creation spirit of climate adaptation. We identified the options that we wanted to work on, the issues. We did studies to see how we wanted to implement this measure, this pilot. We developed it, and right now we are in the post-construction or post-implementation of what we did. But to show you more precisely what our project consisted of, it's what I have this slide. When we decided to work with the city of Merida, the first step of the project preparation was for us to identify a very particular vulnerable neighborhood that we wanted to work on. And this neighborhood that we chose, that is called Plan de Ayala Sur, is vulnerable in many different levels. It's very vulnerable to the effects of climate change, also because of the socio-demographic characteristics of the population or the residents. It was also particularly vulnerable. And it has the specificity that it is next to a nature reserve that is called Cuxal, and this made the urbanization, the growing urbanization of this neighborhood, kind of like a challenge for the natural reserve, because the city or the neighborhood was growing so much into the reserve that something needed to be done. We conducted several analyses with the official data from the municipality, but also with our own tools to see what were the main challenges. And it was not surprising to us that the vegetation had suffered from a lot of decreases because of the growing urbanization, and that it was also that the surface temperature had massively increased over the last years, and that was kind of like a signal for heat island effects in the neighborhood. And what we did after we did this co-creation process with the community to ask them what was their opinion on what we should do and how we should tackle these challenges, we came up with this Biosolar Maya. That is kind of like our climate adaptation measure. If you translate Biosolar Maya, Biosolar you can translate to like an ecologic piece of land or like an ecologic space. And Maya refers to the significant population that is from the Mayan indigenous group that lives in that community. And it reflects the fact that the Mayan community, this like the whole concept of this Biosolar Maya was actually inspired in practices from the Mayan community in pre-colonization times. And this Biosolar Maya integrates different nature-based solutions and components of green infrastructure. You can see them in the right or in the bottom side of the images. It's kind of like a whole concept of different nature-based solutions. We had, for instance, these growing beds, which are kind of like growing parcels for the community to grow specific plants, also with the purpose of medicinal plants that is very attached to the Mayan culture, but also to provide some kind of like food sovereignty so that people can go there, plant their stuff. It's kind of like a community garden, so to say. We also made a measure of rain gardens because, as I said, it's very prone to flooding, and we wanted to address that. So we also included in this public space a rain garden. We also included a pollinator area, and that with the spirit, as I said, that the reserve was being affected by the growing urbanization. So we wanted to create a solution that also tackled and that also contributed to the increase of the biodiversity that was present before the growing urbanization. And we also did it's not a nature-based solution, but it's part of green infrastructure. What we did is, because of the heat islands, we wanted to make sure that we had like white gravel covers so that the heat island effect was not as present. And this is a very comprehensive measure. The Biosolar Maya, it's a whole concept in the community, and something that, even though we're in the post, we're still measuring what are the effects, not only in terms of climate change effects, but also in the quality of life of people. But what I can gather from the learnings from this experience is that how important it is to consider the culture and consider that the community has also ideas on how to address these challenges, and we can also use this to our advantages as city planners or city developers to include their ideas and engage in these co-creation processes. And that's the experience that I wanted to share. As I said, tomorrow, or not tomorrow, next week, Jeremy is going to tell you more about the development cycle, and we can keep talking about this model of implementing these demonstration projects. But without going into more details, that's what I wanted to show you. And now I would want to give the word to Jeremy, and I'm also going to give you the main speaker right so that you can also change your slides as you want, Jeremy. And I just want to say a small advertisement again. Please post your questions in the chat if you have them. And if you are a city representative, please put like, I'm from city XYX, so that we can know that you're a city representative and give you kind of like the preference, because this is mostly for city representatives. But yeah, Jeremy, you have the word.
Great. Thanks, Adriana, and thank you, everybody. I am pleased to be here and pleased to be able to share some interesting insights with you. I have a lot of slides that I'm looking forward to sharing with you, but I'm actually anticipating that I will be sharing those slides afterwards because I'm going to go through a few of them and instead use this as an opportunity to tell some of my top tips, my top recommendations for cities. So while everybody else was speaking, I looked through to see who's logged on and who is joining us. And I see that based off of family names, based off of me knowing some of you, and it's good to see some of you from the African Urban Lab joining as well. I know many of you are representing cities across Africa, and I want to make this as relevant as possible for those city representatives dialing in from across Africa. So the first thing I'll say, and this is something that Neil already alluded to, financing adaptation is really tough. And I think that it's not something that has even really been considered over the past probably 50 years. It's only over the past few years that we're seeing that there is an exacerbation of the challenges that come from things that are related to adaptation. And so a lot of people are talking about we need to find ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We need to find ways to reduce the impacts of mitigation. But the reality is that most African cities, most Asian cities are not the places that are producing those greenhouse gases. Instead, they are the ones that are often the victims of the pollution that is happening, the changes in climate that is in fact leading to the challenges that we are looking at. So again, first point, anybody who says financing adaptation is easy is lying to you. It is not easy, but it can be extremely meaningful for you as a city leader or a city representative trying to figure out how do you climate proof? How do you think about the resilience of your city? So point number one, much more challenging, but also it is a much more significant challenge for cities across Africa and Asia. So I'm based in the Western Cape of South Africa, outside of Cape Town, and I find that we are dealing with some of the worst problems relating to climate change. And I know that we're focusing mostly on secondary cities, but it would be silly for me not to also talk about primary cities, in this case, the city of Cape Town. For anybody who is a city person and doesn't appreciate the fact that the city of Cape Town was probably the first of international cities that any of us know about and lived through that faced a drought, we need to recognize that droughts will become more and more common. Adriana is from Mexico. Mexico City is facing the challenges of a drought. And we need to find ways that we can look at the challenges related to droughts. Yet, if we look at it, the city of Cape Town was able to figure out a solution out of droughts. It was able to figure out how to augment its water supply. So this is absolutely an adaptation example, But it's an example where the city of Cape Town was able to finance that because of the strength of its financial capacity. And so I want to compare that with some of the secondary cities across South Africa that are continuing to face challenges relating to drought, and then compare that further with cities that are facing the opposite challenge of flooding, of coastal erosion, of trying to figure out how they actually can deal with all of these challenges. Which brings me to the main point of my presentation, which is that we can talk about adaptation finance, we can talk about climate finance, but the reality is that we need to talk about finance as the underpinning question that we're trying to deal with. So adaptation finance is a question of the use of proceeds. How are we spending money that we're able to bring in? But the thing that we need to actually be thinking about is how can we help cities, and for many of you, how can we help you to figure out how best to be able to access money that you need? And so when we start talking about finance and financing adaptation, what we need to be thinking about is the fact that there are honestly two different types of broad categories of finance. There's non-repayable finance, which is something that many cities are almost relegated to exclusively look at. And those are funds that come from the municipality's own source revenues, from intergovernmental transfers that come from national or regional government, from crowdsourcing and grants. And if you are a city that has limited exposure to borrowing, limited exposure to having any sort of long-term debt that you need to repay, and there's a question about your credit history or creditworthiness, it will be extremely challenging for you to be raising any sort of repayable finance. So on the screen, you see repayable finance as debt, equity, public-private partnerships, and bonds. When we talk about any of these tools, it's extremely challenging, again, for a secondary city in a developing country to be able to look at a diversity of instruments. And it becomes even more difficult when we're looking at projects that are in adaptation, which is often unfamiliar for funders or investors, and when these projects are not revenue generating. And so, as Neil said, one of the big challenges is that lack of revenue generation on the projects. I'm going to give you two examples. One that we'll talk about, again, City of Cape Town, which might not be the perfect example for repayable finance because it's not necessarily the common experience for most of the cities that are on this call. But then I'm going to give you a second example from a secondary city in Malaysia that I had the chance to speak with earlier today about how they are responding to and how they're actually making it something which is financially viable because they're able to demonstrate a clear story to some key players. And so we don't have time during this lecture, nor tonight or today and next week, to run through all of the examples. But what I want to do is to be in a position that we're able to give you enough of a sense of what can be done and enough of a sense of the types of projects that we know that you are facing. So we know that some cities are facing drought. We know some cities are facing coastal erosion challenges. Some cities are facing flooding. Some cities are facing other physical climate risks. So increased challenges related to excess heat. We know that some cities are facing, especially forested cities, facing the challenge of wildfire. And if we look even at cities in the United States, we can see that happening frequently. So we recognize that all of these are different problems, and we need to find ways that we go beyond these non-repayable sources of finance. So we need to figure out how do we actually look to match funding to municipal projects. And there are four different buckets of categories to look at. The first being around this question of creditworthiness. So how do we help a city to be able to demonstrate good creditworthiness? And that comes from not only having that experience of borrowing and a good credit history, but the experience of being able to demonstrate that the city itself knows how to manage its finances. I spent 5 years advising the mayor of Dakar, and I saw the way that the city was able to increase its performance across the board because of the fact that it was able to increase its own source revenues. I had the opportunity to work in the city of Kampala and see that the Kampala Capital City Authority has had the exact same experiences because of the fact that there was a focus on improving and increasing creditworthiness as its own goal, rather than saying we want to increase our creditworthiness because we want to be able to borrow or take on a diversity of sources of finance. So that own source revenue ends up being one of the biggest ways that we can say, here's how we can demonstrate that a city is in a position to either use its own money wisely or use money it brings in from external sources wisely as well. The second is not necessarily about the city, but about the project itself. So, how do we make sure that the projects that we are looking at, wherever possible, are either able to generate a some sort of revenue, or B, demonstrate that they're able to show that there is a cost savings that occurs? And this is probably a little bit of a challenge to wrap your heads around, because I often find it's difficult whenever I talk to any city about this is what you should be looking at. But if we can find a way that a city is viewed not necessarily as a combination of a number of municipal public departments, but if we look at a city more like a corporation, and when we talk to, for example, a ratings agency, they will think about a city as being a corporate rather than being a public entity. And in fact, most of the rating agencies talk about sovereigns and then sub-sovereigns plus corporate. So if we think about the idea of a city acting like a corporation, what does that actually mean? If the city is acting like a corporation, we're looking at the overall budget of the city, not particular departments. So if one department is able to realize a cost savings or not have a need for as high of a budget, we can ultimately see that we are getting to a place that there's excess revenue available for servicing debt or for making some of these things happen. And we're going to get into some of those examples in a little bit, but wanted to talk about project revenue, not only, or cost savings, not only from the perspective of a particular project, but what does this mean for a city writ large? Looking at the project risk profile. So we know that there will be certain projects that will either be completely unfamiliar as far as technology, as far as the likelihood of people appreciating and wanting to pay for that project, as far as the idea of the technology that is unfamiliar to so many people. What can we really do with that versus something that's brought forward as a project by a known city that has strong credit, where the tech is also well known? And so that risk profile will impact the appetite of an investor or a lender to participate. And then finally, we look at the duration of the project. And so we know that there will be some projects, some of the ones that CitiesAdapt has already supported are relatively short-term projects, whereas there are other projects that have a long anticipated useful life. And we can try to figure out, is there a way in which we can imagine that there will be future revenues that come in on the back of these projects rather than something where we need to immediately generate revenue? So we look at all these different pieces, and then we start trying to figure out, how do we match projects with, so the adaptation projects and use of proceeds with the instruments that we in fact think are so important. And so we can look at this from a number of different perspectives. On the left-hand side of the screen, you will see a number of the different tools that are available where cities are able to see, how can we finance our adaptation projects, and what are the ways that this in fact can be particularly interesting. One of the things that I often will point to is that if a city is in the middle of aggressive growth, and we know that cities across Africa and Asia are urbanizing at an extremely rapid pace, we know that people are often moving from other parts of the country. So there's a lot of internal migration. When we see internal migration happening, and we know that people are coming with money that they can spend, developers will smell that opportunity, and they will often look to build up in areas that might not necessarily be the safest places to build. I know that in a lot of countries, we talk about the 100-year floodplain, but the floodplain is no longer, this is a place that floods once every century, but now once every decade. How can we be smarter about ensuring that where we're building is not going to be the victim of adaptation-related climate change? And so when we look at it from that perspective, we can say that there could be charges that are placed on the developer to make sure that the land upon which the developer is proposing to build will be appropriately drained or will not be a place that regularly floods. How can we make sure that happens? So that's an example of what we mean when we talk about development charges. There are a lot of other transfers that come in from national or state government. Oftentimes they're viewed as top-up grants. Sometimes they're viewed as being performance-based. And so we'll talk about the UNCDF Locale program later. But again, a clear example of something where we see adaptation funding or adaptation finance, depending on the terminology you want to use, being clearly used in order to be able to deliver on projects where it's non-repayable. So again, All these examples are ones where the city does not have the obligation to repay, and something important for us to be keeping in mind. So we can see in this example of the capital of Somaliland that there is an increase in the own source revenue through property taxes, and that this has been something where we see a steady and continuous growth of revenue coming in over a 10-year period that's recently been measured. What it has done is enabled the city to have more money that could be used for the types of projects that make sense to ensure that the city is more resilient, more climate proof, and a place that can withstand more people coming into it. And so that jump of own source revenues by nearly 250% during a 10-year period does a few things. It creates a larger budget where money can be spent on a wide variety of these different projects, but it also leads to a place that we're able to see that there is more confidence from international donors and financiers who want to be putting more money towards exactly these sorts of cities, because they see that these cities are places of growth, and they see that these are places that also are well managed and are able to deliver on goals and expectations. But it's not just a question of how do we be smart about the own source revenue that we're collecting from a tax perspective. In this example, in one of the counties in Kenya, the county decided that it wanted to create a climate change fund. And so this climate change fund, which was able to pool resources from county budgets as well as external donors, was really the catalyst to be able to ensure that local communities have access to climate finance directly for their adaptation activities, including things like water harvesting and drought resilience. So from that perspective, we're able to imagine that cities know how to be able to access the types of funds that are required to be able to deliver on their vision of that future where we know that there is not necessarily the same stability for business as usual from a climate perspective. And so yet another clear example of something that a city has been able, or a county in this case, but a subnational government has been able to deliver that has been transformational for what's been really envisioned. But we can talk about repayable, non-repayable finance all day long. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. And so what we need to start talking about is how do we diversify the funding sources? How are we able to make sure that cities are able to not just wait until more money comes in from government transfers, from their budget, from whatever else, but instead, how can we accelerate some of the implementation of the investments that are needed? And so there are three different examples that you'll see on the screen. Concessional finance, which is money that comes from development banks and DFIs, sometimes a blend of repayable and non-repayable funds. Debt financing, which is at commercial rates, and then public-private partnerships. This slide is a little bit of a misnomer for me for two reasons. Number one, I would hesitate to call a public-private partnership truly repayable finance. Instead, it's a contracting modality. But for many people, there's this belief that a PPP is the answer and it doesn't fit into non-repayable finance. So we slot it in here. Another tip from me. Let's think about what the motivation is for the private sector whenever it's doing something. You as city representatives have a responsibility to deliver things against the public good. You don't necessarily need to worry about profitability, but you do need to worry about financial sustainability. The private sector is not motivated necessarily by public good. Yes, it's always great if we can do things for a lot of people and tell a nice story about it, but private sector is not responsible to citizens or the public. It is responsible to the private sector. It is responsible to its shareholders. It is responsible for looking after profitability. So at a very fundamental level, if it's a project that you as a city do not feel that you would be able to have as something financially sustainable, it's extremely challenging to imagine that there is a world where the private sector would want to take up that responsibility. So please do not assume that a PPP is the panacea for everything. In fact, in most instances, a PPP is both challenging to design, challenging to procure, but it's also challenging to make sure that it is something that delivers on the goals that both the public and private sector want. And just to use an example, I've had the pleasure of working with a city in South Africa on its water sector PPP and have been shocked at the way that the private sector has really forced the public sector into a position of submission to the extent that it does not have all the things that it wanted, even in its initial negotiation for what the overall goals were. And so let's again remember that a PPP is probably not the solution, especially when we're talking about adaptation finance. The second thing that I'll say is that for many of the cities on this call, and many of those cities are secondary cities, uh, it's extremely challenging to even start thinking about how to access money from some of the DFIs. And I know that we have, or at least had, I have not looked at the list of participants in a little bit, but I know we have somebody from the African Development Bank's Urban and Municipal Development Fund. And I can imagine that there would be a very big concern if cities across sub-Saharan Africa, for example, started going after trying to borrow commercially for projects that require a long repayment period and are not necessarily demonstrated to be revenue generating. So while debt financing is important to list on any slide where we talk about repayable finance, I question heavily whether it's something that we should be necessarily recommending for you. But again, in the purpose of wanting to be comprehensive, we have listed it. And I want to just make sure that you are not reading this and saying, Jeremy and his team are saying that every city should go out and borrow commercially for adaptation, because that is not the right answer and would be, I think, a poor recommendation and a poor takeaway if that's the way that you would want to view this. So instead, let's look to see what does it mean when we're talking about concessionary finance. From a concessionary finance perspective, we can look at repayable or non-repayable finance that is put in. And again, a lot of you who are finance people might say, so Jeremy, why are you talking about concessional finance and non-repayable in the same sentence? The reality is that some of these ways that we create a blended finance solution in adaptation finance is through looking at the repayable portion, that repayable portion being something where we see that there is a very clear concessionality on both the interest rate, so cheaper than commercial, as well as a long term, which is longer than what commercial banks would offer. So when we compare concessional and commercial, it's typically about tenor and interest rate. So what is the price of the money and how long can you get it for? Compared with that non-repayable piece on the right-hand side, when we create a blended finance solution, we typically are looking to see how can we put together those two sides of the equation. And oftentimes it comes in a number of the different forms that we'll see on the next slide. So we can see, like I said, that there's that concessional loan, which is what people typically think about when imagining this. And again, the bilateral and multilateral DFIs are the typical providers of those concessionary loans, where they're financing things like affordable housing, clean energy, education, health, other areas like that. And then we can see that grants, again, where they are either repayable or non-repayable. And yes, there are repayable grants where they are put out and paid back zero interest. So again, some of you might say it's not really a grant, but it's a loan. In any case, that's the nomenclature that we start to look at. But it's down towards the bottom that I think we start seeing interesting things happen. So we look at viability gap funding, and that to me is that quintessential piece of what blended finance can be. When we say, how do we put together the non-repayable piece, which would be that VGF, with the repayable, such that we're able to achieve a price point or a debt repayment schedule that in fact works for you as the municipality who might be borrowing. So this is something that I think is really interesting for us to be looking at. And Gugu, I'm glad that you're asking the question around VGF. Let's pick that up. And I also am glad that you're on, because the city that I was referencing as far as that water PPP was Mobella, and what happened as far as the way that things were initially structured and the way that over the past 7-10 years we've been able, so me as part of the USAID team, but others as well, were able to step in and help to make sure that the structuring of the supplementary agreements in fact deliver what everybody is looking for. So when we talk VGF, I would say that the biggest thing for us to be thinking about is how do we make sure that we are structuring a project and making a very clear case that we can in fact get to financial sustainability without the contribution of some degree of subsidy. And so that subsidy might come from the same provider of capital. Clear example would be GCF, who's able to come in and support cities, but the support to cities typically would come in the form of a hybrid of a loan and then non-repayable finance in the form of that VGF. So that's the way that we would imagine that this ends up getting put together. But again, a lot of reasons that there's different types of VGF that are provided, but more importantly, different motivations for VGF to in fact get put out. So we think about this and then we say, well, so why are cities borrowing in the first place? And this probably could have come as my very, or it can come in at this point, because this is the crux again of why cities are in a position that they do not have enough money. So if we look at the orange side on the left, those blocks are all the things that make up a municipal budget on the expenditure side. And we see that the lower pieces are your operational costs, your upper pieces are your development cost. The reality is that in most cases, the green blocks, so those are your revenue that comes in the form of the 3 T's, so taxes, tariffs, and transfers, as well as anything else that comes in grants, in other participation that is unrestricted. That money is insufficient to meet what we have on that left side on the orange blocks. And so the question, and the thing that whenever I go to a new city and I'm asked to do some sort of analysis, the first thing I do is ask the treasurer, what percentage of your overall expenditure, your actual expenditure rather than your budgeted expenditure, is being spent on capital investment? So the long-term investment needs. And I would say that the average that I hear is that people say, we've budgeted for 40% to be for development costs and capital expenditure. And I say, again, please, thank you very much. But I'd like to know not what you budgeted, but at the end of the year, what does your year-end accounting show you? And so they say, oh, well, we budgeted 40%. No, I understand. What was your actual expenditure? And the number is anywhere from 0 to 10% typically. And that 10% is an outlier and is typically in those cities that are in a position that they are well managed. They have the budget that they can spend on a variety of things, and they typically have a larger amount of revenue coming in. So if you take an already shrunken capital expenditure budget, and then we add the conversation around, we, as the climate team, as the planning team, would love to see that you put money towards adaptation. The city treasurer, unless they are particularly motivated to support climate, will laugh you out of the room, because he or she will say, this is not revenue generating, and we have other priorities. We have priorities of providing housing, water, solid waste management, better transport, education, health, all of these different things where we can see that there's either an immediate repayment or there's a long-term investment into the city, which will hopefully reap future dividends. So that concept of adaptation finance being introduced ends up being something that is extremely difficult for anybody who's in a leadership position on the finance side to start to imagine. And this slide gives you a sense of what some of the key finance instruments are for municipal projects. But like I said, I want to instead talk about some of the case studies and the examples that I think tell really good stories. So the first one, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is the green municipal bond that the city of Cape Town was able to issue a handful of years ago. It's an interesting case, but it's also one, and I think that we have some people from Cape Town on the call. It's a case that I find replicating, and it's hard to imagine replicating for a couple of reasons. Number one, to issue a green municipal bond requires that you have a very strong set of financials and that you're able to go to either the local or international capital markets and issue a bond to investors that would find this an attractive offering, which means you need to be of a significant enough size as a municipality. You need to have a strong enough budget. You need to be able to issue a transaction which is large enough for investors to be interested. So this is not going to happen everywhere. Second thing, though, is that issuing a green municipal bond is challenging as far as the ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So, one of the things that I regularly hear whenever I engage with anybody from City of Cape Town is that they found it extremely challenging to make sure that they were reporting everything in a way that they collected the right information from a number of different departments and then were able to put that back out for people to be looking at, especially those investors who want to make sure that the proceeds were used for green. A portion of these proceeds were used for municipal water infrastructure around the time that Cape Town was heading towards day zero. And so some people argue that this is a prime example of adaptation finance. I would agree that it might be a good case study as an outlier, but is unlikely to be something which is replicated in many other places. In fact, and again, maybe there was some method to the madness that GIZ had in CitiesAdapt, but the two places that there were some really interesting green municipal bond issuances over the course of the past 10 years were in South Africa, in the city of Cape Town, where South Africa also is where Umhlutuze sits, and then in Mexico, where Mexico City also issued a green municipal bond, and where Merida sits. Having talked with the then treasurer of Mexico City when the green municipal bond was issued, Mexico City had many of the same complaints and challenges. And like I said earlier, Mexico City and Cape Town are two international cities where droughts are and will likely continue to be a challenge, other than the fact that Renell, who's on the call, let me know that the rains have totally set in the city of Cape Town. And so I think people have a false sense of security on the amount of rain which the city will likely to have into the future. The other example, though, is the one that I talked about at the very beginning. And this is one that I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about. And so this is the concept of a public-private partnership. And what I'm going to show you is an example from that city in Malaysia that I thought was particularly interesting from what it is trying to do. So again, we've talked about what PPPs look like, and there's a number of different ways they. Anybody who has questions about this, please feel free to pose them. Happy to run through it. But the example in Malaysia is the one that I think is particularly worth looking at. And for some reason, I can't get to the next slide. I don't know why it's not allowing me to go. There we are. I hope that you can all see this. So this was a really interesting example that I heard about earlier today. One of the cities in Malaysia, a secondary city, has been plagued by horrible flooding over the past 5-10 years. And every time there's flooding, the city needs to relocate people who are living in areas that are proximate to those flood zones and where the flooding is so bad that they need to relocate, and sometimes their houses need to be knocked down. And so the city leadership said, we need to figure out what the right solution is. And the right solution was not necessarily completely clear. They said, we can try to dig deeper canals and trenches that would be able to take water out of the city. But that wasn't really a smart call from an engineering perspective. And they said that they thought it might actually end up washing out parts of the city. So they said, we can't do that, but we have this adaptation challenge. We also know that if we want to do that major engineering play, it will be something which will be too costly for us. So they recognized, and again, next week we'll talk about how you identify a problem, how you then figure out the suite of solutions in a pre-feasibility study, and then how you pick the most intelligent of them based off of ease of delivery, based off of cost, based off of appetite from community, and a number of other factors. So they said, we would be interested, but we don't think we can make something work from an engineering perspective or a cost perspective to have more water that can just pass through the city more easily. But we don't want to continue business as usual, which is also a way that we do any of these analyses. So if we're going to imagine that there needs to be some sort of a solution, what is a middle ground? And so the city was able to partner with insurance companies. And you might say, insurance companies don't sound like they would be the logical partner. But what the city was able to do is to partner with insurance companies and say that we recognize that every time there's a flooding event, you have huge payouts that you need to make. And rather than be in a position that you need to make these very large payments, and you often are struggling to be able to make your insurance company work because of the fact that there are so many claims. What can we instead do with you? And so the insurance companies said that they would like to do two different things. Number one, cover the cost of early warning systems that are able to help to flag for people when, as a matter of fact, there will be anticipated large flooding events. But a large flooding event, knowing about it just means you can get out and not get killed in the flood. But it doesn't mean that we're actually preserving property. And so the other thing that they've been able to do is, with minor changes to the stormwater management system and introducing some sustainable urban drainage solutions, they've been able to actually see that they can turn switches when the alarms go off, and the switches mean that there's ways that that water gets redirected without re-engineering the entire city. So this is a perfect case study, at least from my perspective, of where the private sector is coming in a different sort of partnership than what we typically see. The partnership is not where the private sector is necessarily the service provider, but instead the private sector is coming in to help to cover the cost in partnership with the city. And I feel like the more that we see these creative solutions to adaptation challenges, the better off we will be from an overall perspective on trying to address things that were unanticipated and unprecedented in human history. So the more that we can do that sort of solution, the more that we can look to say, here is the challenge, and then here are some of the problems that we can start to imagine, the better off we are likely to be. So I know that we have only a limited amount of time left in today's session. I wanted to, like I said, also at least show you the slide on Locale. So Locale, which is supported by UNCDF and GCF, is a particularly impressive program. There's Locale performance-based grants across much of Africa and Asia. There are countries that are signing up and fresh interest in this idea of having a performance-based grant where the payout comes after the realization of whatever the anticipated KPI or outcome was, rather than something which is just direct payment and nobody is satisfied because private sector finds, okay, we got paid, but it actually costs us more to deliver on this. The public sector says we haven't gotten what we actually were looking for. And then the providers of grants, where grants are involved, also are frustrated. A performance-based grant actually is helpful because it empowers local government to manage adaptation finance effectively and transparently, but it also makes sure that we see that there is an increase in the amount of money at the local level to make the sorts of investments that are required to deliver on the sorts of adaptation goals that we want to see. And so I know that we ran through a whole bunch of different things during the course of the 30 minutes that I had. And I wanted to give you that exposure so that you're able to say, okay, I got some things out of that particular session. But I also want to say this session is intended to really be a teaser for next week. So next week is where I think a lot of you will be able to get even more out of it, because we're going to be doing two different things during next week's session. The first thing we're going to do is to talk through the project development cycle and help you as cities to figure out, so where exactly are we? Are we at a place that we already have figured out the problem, the solution? We've done our detailed engineering design, we've done our financial modeling, we're ready to be able to absorb money? Or are we actually further back in the process? And are we still trying to identify what the problem is and how best to come up with the right sorts of solutions? And so the first part is talking that through. And that's a lot of what appears in the model approach and handbook that Adriana, I think, has already referenced, but we'll make sure that we share this so that people are able to look at this. But the second part is the cool part. So I know that there's a question that came up asking, how do we get money into Madagascar for projects? And I would say, and challenge everybody, let's not jump immediately to, we need to figure out how we get money in for the capital investment into projects. But let's do a step back from that. let's figure out how do we bring in the right sorts of money to make sure that projects are well designed? How do we bring in the right sorts of money to ensure that we not only have access to the capex or the capital expenditure required, but how do we also make sure that we have money coming in that ensures the project is financially sustainable, that we have the money that's required for operations and maintenance so that we can see a project go to the end of its expected useful life rather than have it be abandoned or unable to continue to function the way that people would want it to at peak efficiency. So the best way to do that isn't through coming to a bunch of webinars and hearing, and I shouldn't say that because you're all here, and thank you everybody again for coming, but it's not a question of, is it that we go and we hear at a high level what the solutions are, or is it instead that we want to be in a position that we are identifying on specific projects, your projects, the right way to ensure that they move responsibly through the development cycle? So we have representatives coming in from the GAP Fund, from the AFDB's UMDF, from C40, all of whom are going to be able to talk about this is how we can provide you with support. And so the work that the GAP Fund and that UMDF both do is providing that support to projects that are at an early stage. And so we have, like I said, representatives coming from those three agencies who will be able to talk about what they do, what they have done, and probably most importantly, how this could be helpful for you. So with that, I'm going to look to see what questions there are. And while I'm doing that, I think that some of my colleagues on the call have already had a chance to look at some of the questions coming in. So I'm going to look maybe for Neil has a question that he's already identified that he'd like to answer, and then I'll look through the list as well. Please feel free to keep on putting your questions in the chat. We have time to run through this with you.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I see there's a question on case studies of where philanthropies have successfully worked with cities on adaptation. There are a few one-off examples, but generally speaking, philanthropies don't tend to directly fund individual cities, though many of them are committed to supporting cities and towns to build their adaptation resilience to climate impacts. Generally speaking, they tend to work through other organizations which can provide this support. So, for example, quite a lot of funding goes to organizations like C40 Cities, which works with the larger cities, the Resilient Cities Network, ICLEI, and many others. And the way they tend to work is because philanthropic funding is quite limited in terms of what's available. They prefer to put their money into these programs where these specialists can then go in and work with individual towns and cities and develop strategies and investment plans rather than necessarily putting their money directly into towns and cities, because they only have a limited amount to work with, and that money would quite rapidly be used up on a very small number of projects as a result. So alongside those networks, there are also entities like the GAP Fund, as we've already mentioned, like the World Bank and other development banks often run their own platforms around helping towns and cities improve their creditworthiness, or sometimes providing guarantees and so forth to underwrite the costs of these projects. I would say that whilst the temptation would be to reach out to philanthropies directly, in most cases, it's probably unlikely to be that successful. I would actually recommend reaching out to, well, the CitiesAdapt team as a good starting point, but also these other networks and platforms, because they will have more direct access to that support from the philanthropic sector. So hopefully that provides a good answer on that.
I saw another question coming up asking about what tips do we have for a city that has low creditworthiness? And I'll answer that in two ways. The first, let's not get too hung up on low creditworthiness as a problem in and of itself. unless we are trying to access capital from investors who have an expectation of a certain level of creditworthiness. So I'll go off a little bit on a tangent, but I've had the opportunity, along with some other colleagues, to design a credit enhancement platform for cities across India over the past couple of years. And one of the things that we did was we analyzed what the types of projects are that the cities would want to be investing into. And it was a mix of both adaptation and mitigation, although more of it was mitigation. So I said, that's interesting. I'd like to see them do more on adaptation. And they said that they were struggling on two fronts. Number one, they were struggling because of the fact that these adaptation projects were not viewed as being directly revenue generating, which was a problem for many of the investors who might participate and provide capital. But the second challenge was the fact that for many of these cities, their creditworthiness was below what the requirement was for institutional investors. So in India, any pension fund or insurance company that wants to invest into a subnational transaction needs for either the issuer, but typically both the issuer and the transaction, to have a credit rating of a minimum of a double A. And so the challenge was that there are some interesting cities that had good projects that were financially stable, revenue generating, a blend of adaptation and mitigation projects, but that their credit rating was a single A or a triple B. And so we said, to ensure that there is an acceleration of the deployment of capital for these sorts of projects in cities that are desperately looking for longer tenor, so longer time horizon investment, as well as cheaper capital that would be slightly concessionary, we said, let's introduce a credit enhancement, a guarantee that offers an uplift from that triple B or single A to a double A, which ultimately has led to the development of a pipeline of roughly $850 million worth of projects that are likely to get funded that would not have gotten funding without that guarantee. Their creditworthiness is still not as strong as it should be, but because of the fact that there was the ability for the introduction of this other financial instrument, we are seeing that there is appetite from institutional investors to put capital towards climate projects, and again, towards both mitigation and adaptation. But I know that was a tangent. So coming back to what tips for a city that has low creditworthiness. So first, do a proper assessment of your finances. Look to see what is your baseline. So the ways that I look at this, what is the total available tax roll that you might be able to look at? So I know in many places property taxes are not assessed because there is both no incentive to pay and no penalty for a failure to pay. I was talking to somebody earlier today who said that in a city in Nigeria that she's been working in, that they have roughly 5% tax collection. So we know that we need to start to address that. And starting from that baseline and showing the improvement off of a baseline by both having better cadastral maps to understand what the tax rolls look like, as well as better collection efficiency. So not just are you billing people, but are you collecting against what you're billing? If we can increase both billing and collection efficiency and use that as a basis to be able to engage the aid agencies and the development finance institutions that have an appetite to provide support to cities, because they either believe that cities in and of themselves should be stronger, which is the case with most aid agencies, or because as a development finance institution, we also appreciate that stronger cities could potentially in the future come in as borrowers from the institution. In either of those cases, we can imagine that creditworthiness ends up being important. So part of it is figuring out what your baseline is. Part of it is having a plan for improving off of that baseline. And so I feel like having that in place is often enough to be able to start a conversation with a development partner who wants to provide that support. And I would say as a final thing, if you've already sorted out your creditworthiness and you are a AAA rated city or would have the equivalent of a AAA rating on the local scale against what your national government is performing at, there would be no role for an aid agency or a DFI to provide that support. So there is nothing wrong with being at a lower place to start, as long as you have the ambition of going higher. And I would say that part of that is really just making sure what your story is and where you would want to go. And in the case of adaptation or climate more generally, how do we make sure that there is a climate action plan, which in fact aligns with all of this and requires a certain amount of funding, such that you say our climate action plan has investment requirements. The city cannot afford all of those investment requirements. So, in order to be able to bring in other sources of funding and to diversify that funding base, we need to be able to demonstrate that we have the capacity to manage money coming in and then repay it as per whatever the debt schedule might be. So I hope that that answers that question. While I have the mic, I'll do one more question. So I see, can we bundle or aggregate smaller projects to create a more attractive investment pipeline? Yes. There are two challenges that I would highlight or flag. The first, if we are looking to bundle or aggregate smaller projects, we would probably want to see that projects are able to, in some cases, that there's just some projects that can generate revenue. And so that we're able to imagine that if we are creating an investment pipeline, that there might be some that are non-revenue generating, but others that are revenue generating, and that the full amount of money required to service debt is being generated in aggregate by the projects. I know that there are a lot of people who are big proponents of place-based financing, and we've just finished a review of some of London's boroughs who want to pursue a place-based finance approach for adaptation. The reality is that if you do not have projects that in aggregate are able to generate sufficient revenue to service your debt, it might be problematic. So I would say, first, ensure that the projects you have all in aggregate create the right sort of picture, or if you're planning on going after non-repayable finance or funding, that this is something where all of the projects align with whatever the donor or development partner has in mind that they would want to support. So that's the first one. The second, and this is a related point, but not all projects will get to a point that they're revenue generating at the same time. So I would say it could be really problematic if you are borrowing for projects and that most of those projects are not, again, revenue generating at the same point in time, which means you will have free rider projects that are coming along and not actually participating in being able to deliver. So I hope that those answers were helpful. I'm going to hand maybe to Adriana to moderate, to pick one or two questions and ask people if they want to ask their questions directly.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeremy. We have another questions. I mean, we have a couple of them more to cover, but I just want to say before that that Jeremy and his team were really gracious, and they said that if they didn't manage to cover all of these questions, that they would reply to you in a written form. So fill out the survey that we're gonna show in a couple of minutes, so that you can also receive those. But I just want to post in the question we have from Google. What are some of the defined conditions and performance measures for accessing performance-based grants? If you can just cover this, and I think after that we would need to move to the survey slash closing part. Thank you, Jeremy.
Neil, do you want to take that or do you want me to?
I can have a go at it, and then maybe if you complement with any additional thoughts. So yes, it is a good question. When we talk adaptation resilience, can be quite a difficult set of concepts and needs to quantify, which is quite critical for performance-based grants. The Generally speaking, the focus tends to be on the reduction in vulnerability to climate risk, which is a combination of reduced exposure to the particular risks and the reduced severity of impact of those risks. So, for example, flood defences might reduce the risk of a flood event occurring, and if it does occur, it may also reduce the level of damage that's caused because it prevents most of the water from flooding a particular area. For performance-based grants, this is the challenge that needs to be addressed, which is how do you actually measure and quantify both the climate risk, which can sometimes be difficult to do without a considerable amount of data because there's a lot of uncertainty involved, and the potential cost and effectiveness of the adaptation measure itself. Now, this is getting easier to do. There is far more data and tools available now, open source, free tools, or fairly or affordable tools that can allow towns and cities to measure this and quantify it. And with that sort of data, it's possible to make a strong argument or explicitly define the effectiveness of these approaches when making performance applications for performance-based grants. So that would be a critical thing I would highlight there. The other thing I would also mention is that other slightly more complex approaches are also becoming slightly easier to define. So nature-based financing, more community-led based adaptation measures and so forth. Again, there is more sophistication now than there was in the past for how this is measured and defined, and that again makes it a lot easier when applying for these types of grants and justifying them. Those would be my headline thoughts. I don't know, Jeremy, if there's anything you'd want to add on top of that.
I guess the only other thing to just always be clear on when we're trying to figure out performance-based grants or really any type of outcome-based finance is what is the baseline and have we negotiated the baseline correctly? And so very similarly to what I argued on creditworthiness, it's all about baseline and improvements in performance off of that baseline. That's the exact same thing that we want to be doing. And so coming back to some of these examples that I've seen where we either have a PPP and the baseline is artificially set too low or too high, I would say that on a performance-based grant, let's make sure that we're setting the target at a realistic place based off of where the baseline actually is, and make sure that it is as scientifically based as possible. So in the case of some of the things that Adriana has been able to successfully deliver in Merida, we want to make sure that we are starting from a baseline that is a realistic baseline, that maybe this is what it was, the temperatures were 5 years ago, rather than what the temperatures are right now, because those are already elevated. So let's figure out what our baseline is, and then how do we return to that baseline or surpass what that actually looks like. So that would be the only other thing to add. But I know Adriana probably now is feeling like we only have 4 minutes left and we need to as a survey. So Adriana, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you so much, Neil, for answering the questions. And also thank you for the audience for participating and engaging. As I said, Jeremy and his team were kind enough, and they will reply to your questions in a written form. But for that, we kindly ask you to please take some, don't go yet, just take 5 minutes of your time to please answer this survey. We have them in the different languages, in English, Portuguese, and French, and we're going to give you like 3 minutes here so that you can answer those surveys. Please leave your contact information so that we can share the slides with you, and that we can also count your city to be eligible to win a one-on-one with Jeremy. So we will be quiet for like 2-3 minutes, and then we will continue with the next steps and information for the next session.
Who wants to turn on some music?
We should have thought about that. That's a great idea, Jeremy.
I have a song already in mind. Thinking of
Next
Owl
week.
City Fireflies. It's one of my faves.
So that you've given us homework as a group. We will come up with questions, sorry, music that we want to play while you're answering questions next week, because we want to make sure that this is a fully satisfying experience for you, and I think that that's just another thing that we want to make sure to bring you as part of the overall experience of working with us on adaptation finance. I think we're going to start seeing people drop because they probably only have 1 more minute. So Adriana, if you want to just do another 30 seconds to close out.
Yes, I will. I was just checking if the answers are coming in, and I think they are. But yes, before leaving, just the last 30 seconds, we kindly invite you to the next session that is going to take place in a week, next Wednesday at 2 to 4. As Jeremy was already talking about, we're going to have a very interesting session with some of the project preparation facilities attending, like the GAP Fund, CFF, and we're also going to have the presence of a representative from UMDF, from the African Development Bank. Please, if you're interested, share also the invitation with your colleagues, with other cities that you know. And just a kind of reminder, if you were in the session today and if you're also in the next session, you're gonna win. Not gonna win. You're gonna get a chance to win a one-on-one session with Jeremy and or with Neil or with the both of them. I think you've already seen their great inputs, their expertise, and how valuable this can be. And without anything else to say, please finish filling out the surveys. It would be super useful for us. And thank you so much for participating. And also thank you so much, Jeremy, Neil, for your inputs, and also Dorothy and Letty, who were in the background doing all the important things that needed to be done for these webinars. And thank you so much to the city representatives who joined today. And I think with that, we can close today's session and stop the recording, and wish you a very lovely rest of the day, evening, or morning. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.